Good morning, Go Gators. Here's one of my favorite authors. He's a thinker. He's an author, a guy by the name of Malcolm Gladwell. Some of you may read and listen to him. Malcolm Gladwell has this quote, and I find it very intriguing. He says that you and I, and we'll throw this up on the screen, you and I have a storytelling problem. That we're a bit too quick to come up with explanations for things that there really isn't an explanation for. Now, I think this is true, and you can test drive this this week at your family Thanksgiving. Just in the middle of your meal, just go pandemic and see how many people have an explanation. You could go Kyle Rittenhouse trial and see how many people have an explanation. You could go Florida Gators football and see how many people have an explanation. And by the way, I read this week that every man in America believes that they can do two things: grill and coach football. But that's true. And most of us can't. But that's a whole nother thing. But I think it's true that a lot of us in this room, we have a storytelling problem. And so here's what I would love to do if I could this morning. Every single one of you, either under your chair or in the chair in front of you, has an index card. I hope it's there. If you're watching at home, if you could grab something to write with, and you here in the room, if you could grab something to write with. And this is what I'm going to ask you to do. We're going to give you about 30 seconds, and we're going to give you some thinking music to do this. But I want you to take the thing that you can write with, and I want you to write down the 5 most important people, places, or things in your life. The 5 priorities of your life. You're going to write these down. It should only take 30 seconds because and you don't have to put them in order. You just got to write them down, okay? And we're going to give you, again, thinking music to do this. 5 most important people, places, or things. Here we go. On your mark, get set, write them down. Okay, cool. Most of you didn't really have to think about that long. You wrote them down very quick. I saw some of you comparing notes, which was cheating, but that's a whole nother thing. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at your list, and of the 5 things you have written down, I want you to think of the least important thing of those 5 things. The least important thing of those 5 things, and I want you to scratch through it and eliminate it. Some of you are regretting writing down all the names of your children, okay? Because you are now having to choose. Some of you, the rebellious one, you're a goner, okay? So now you have 4 left. Of the 4 priorities you have left, which of those 4 is the least important thing? And mark that one out. And some of you know where I'm going. You already are not looking forward to this. Now you have 3. Of the 3 most important things that you have left, which of those 3 is the least important? And now you have 2. And if there was a drum roll, this is where we would put it. Because of the 2 people, places, or things that you have left, which of those 2 is least important? And I want to say this to every husband and father in the room. If your wife wrote down children and your name, you, sir, have been eliminated, okay? Because your kids are going to come before you, okay? So now you should have 1 thing on your card. 1 thing. And some of you, you're like, okay, I'm a little nervous about this. And there are men here going, dude, you rushed me. I put my truck. All right, now listen. The question is, does that thing really matter? Because what you're in essence saying is this is the priority to you. Does it really matter? And especially as it relates to the storytelling problem, as it relates to the next generation, and just so that I can get a lay of the land in the room, how many of you in this room, and even watching at home, you're a parent? You are a parent. Most of us in this room are parents. How many of you, you're a grandparent, okay? Awesome. Favorite part of Thanksgiving are you guys, okay? How many of you, you're an auntie or an uncle, okay? You have nieces and nephews. Very cool. How many of you, you are the child of a parent? I just saw a teenager go, what? All right, that's you, okay? Here's the interesting thing about all of us in this room. If you are sitting with your parents, I just want to say my wife and I have 3 children. We have a son who's 26, a daughter who's 24, a daughter who's 21. And I want to say on behalf and as a representative for every parent in this room and not in this room, to those of you who are children sitting with your parents, am I right, parents, when I say that parenting is by far the most difficult thing I've ever done? Everybody okay? It is the most difficult job I have ever done. And if you are a child sitting with your parents, the reason why it's so hard is you. You're the reason why it's hard. It's hard. But it's hard also, am I right, moms and dads? Because we don't know what we're doing. None of us in this room know what we're doing. So if you're a teenager, a child, or a college student, and you're sitting with your parents, you do need to extend your parents a little bit of grace. Because your parents don't know what they're doing. Adults and parents are just grown-up teenagers. That's all we are. Adults are just teenagers who owe people money. That's who we are. And so we have to wrestle with this idea of what's most important. This is so critical. And what is the narrative and the storytelling problem that we're having? Because all of us in this room, whether you're a parent or an adult or a teenager or a child or a college student, isn't it interesting? The narrative that has been created about the next generation. We think if you listen closely, our culture says that they are the demise of our culture as we know it. And the reason why I wanted you to do this little exercise is because, and Jason mentioned this, I get the honor and privilege for 30 plus years I've been working with the next generation, have zero plans of doing anything else. My wife Kelly's with me, and she and I want to burn with our hair on fire across the finish line, believing in the next generation. And for 20-something years, I've had an opportunity every single summer, every week of the summer, to stand in front of a bunch of teenagers and offer them the hope and forgiveness found in the person of Jesus. And several summers ago, we did the same exercise with thousands of teenagers that you just did. Instead of 1 card, we gave them 5. And we took up their 1 card at the end of the exercise just to see what does the overwhelming data tell us that the next generation thinks is the most important thing to them. And for every parent and every adult in this room who thinks that your child doesn't care about you and your family, the overwhelming data, here's a picture of a card. And I know some of you are going, my kid obviously did not attend that camp. But here's what it says to all of us in the room. That the next generation cares. And the question is, do we? And part of it is that a lot of us here, here's what we start to think. What we start to think is helping our child, our teenager, our college student fall in love with the person of Jesus, start following him and become a Jesus follower in this culture that has so many nooks and crannies and pitfalls seems impossible, to the degree that there are teenagers and there are parents and faith communities all across this country that have literally thrown up their hands and said, we give up. I spent a ton of time with a church in New Jersey that was literally, the pastor was trying to fight the church because the church wanted to do away with youth ministry and college ministry because they wanted to throw their hands up and give up. Because in their mind, it seemed impossible. So if I may, whenever you and I stop trying to do what seems impossible, we settle for a version of life that God never intended. Let me say that again. Whenever you and I stop trying to do what seems impossible, we settle for a version of life that God never intended. And so this morning, quickly, here's what I would love for us to do. I want us to wrestle with an Old Testament a narrative. It's actually a memoir of a man who many secular and Christian leaders consider an incredible model for leadership. But I, a couple of years ago with some of my friends, started rethinking and relearning the story of Nehemiah. A lot of you in this room know that story very well. But to begin to rethink about what actually happened in this story that we have from 580 plus years before the birth of Jesus. So for those of you that don't know, in 587 BC, one of the things you need to know about your Bible is that our scriptures, these 66 books, this library of books that we call the Bible, it is rooted and steeped in history, and especially the Old Testament has so much history in it that most of you don't even realize that you know. So in 587 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, that empire, had for 2 years laid siege on the Mecca of the Hebrew people. Their city, Jerusalem, was under siege by Nebuchadnezzar and the empire of Babylon for 2 years. 2 years to this extent, ladies and gentlemen, that Jews inside the city of Jerusalem, their food and water supply was cut off by Nebuchadnezzar, and they actually started cannibalizing each other just to survive. For 2 years, he lays siege to the city and then decides, let's pillage it. They break into the city. They kill a ton of people inside the city. They burn down the temple, which is so important to the Hebrew people, to the Jewish people. They burn down the city gates. They tear down the city walls. They take most of the beautiful, wealthy, intelligent men and women back to Babylon, and they leave this small remnant of the poor and oppressed in the ruins of the city of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar does that. And here's what's crazy. The city of Jerusalem stayed in that state for 142 years. 142 years, it's in this state. Now watch, there are men and women, parents, raising their children in these ruins. Raising their children in these ruins. And Jerusalem is what is to the Hebrew people what Washington, D.C. is to Americans. It is such an important pinnacle of their faith tradition. And I want you to think, for every parent in the room, for every adult in this room, for every Jesus follower in the room, what it must have been like for moms and dads to be living in those ruins in what was once the most important beacon of hope for the Hebrew nation. And I think this is fair. I think we can assume that those people had lived in those conditions for so long that they started thinking, there's no way. They couldn't see how bad things were anymore, and they couldn't see how things could change. And I would submit to all of us in this room, that is us. For some of us, as it relates to the next generation, we don't see how bad it is anymore, and we don't think it can change. And think about this. There are parents sitting in this ruins, raising their children, trying to remind their kids of how great God is. Does that ever sound like some of us as parents in the room? You are in a culture that doesn't seem to embrace the things of God, and you're trying to tell your children how great God is. Think about parents in the ruins of Jerusalem in 444 or 445 BC telling them how great God is. And they're reminding them, well, there was one time this dude named Moses who split the Red Sea in half, and our people crossed it. And then there was this other time where this guy named David killed a giant and God came through. And then this dude named Joshua, he marched around a city and the walls fell. And then he saved Gilligan off the island. It was amazing, right? All these things that they're telling them. And you know there had to have been a smart aleck middle school kid that in the middle of their parents giving this speech going, whoa, time out. If God is so incredible, why doesn't he do that with us? And if you were that parent, or if I'm that parent sitting in those ruins, would you have said, well, the reason why God doesn't come through for us is because it's impossible? You wouldn't have answered that way. And how do I know you wouldn't have answered that way? Because you're not answering that way now. You're sitting in this room. So here's what happens. In the process of Nebuchadnezzar capturing the people of Israel, taking them back into captivity, the Persian king Cyrus conquers Babylon. The Persian king Cyrus is replaced by a guy named Xerxes. If you've seen the movie 300, that's actual biblical history. Xerxes becomes the king of Persia after Cyrus, and after Xerxes is gone, his son Artaxerxes becomes the king. And in that process, when Cyrus conquers Babylon, he starts letting Jews, Hebrews, trickle back to Jerusalem. But when Artaxerxes is king, we pick up on this guy named Nehemiah, who is a Hebrew who was born in captivity. He wasn't born in Jerusalem. He was born in Babylon. He was born in Babylon, and he's a layperson. He's not a priest like Ezra. He's just a normal guy. And he has this position with the king. We'll get to that in just a second. But here's what happens. Something starts happening in Nehemiah's life as someone who cares about the next generation that we cannot miss. And the first thing that happens in Nehemiah's life is this. He faces the brutal facts. If you're in this room as a parent, an adult, a teenager, a college student, if you and I are going to see correctly and have the proper narrative about the next generation, we have to face the brutal facts. Here's what happened with Nehemiah. He's holding this position. His brother has gone to Jerusalem. His brother comes back from Jerusalem to Babylon, and Nehemiah asks him this question: what is going on in Jerusalem? And here's what his brother tells him. Those who survived the exile, those who were left in the ruins, and those who went back are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. And I want to encourage you at some point this week to go and read in the Old Testament the story of Nehemiah, because here's what Nehemiah does as soon as he gets this word. The scriptures tell us that he sat down and he wept. He was broken for a place and people that he had never been. So for every Jesus follower in the room who's thinking, this isn't for me, this guy who had never been to Jerusalem and had never met those people weeps. In fact, his own memoir tells us that he mourned for several days and he began to beg God. He faced the brutal facts. This is what's gone down in my community, in Jerusalem, where I am originally from. See, I think there's an incredible principle for all of us in this room as people who should care about the next generation. If you cannot face a problem, you cannot fix a problem. Everybody okay? If you can't face it, you can't fix it. So here's what I would love to do. The organization that I work for does a ton of research as a part of our work. And we, along with other organizations around our country, have done so much work in trying to determine what is happening with the next generation. And so I would love for you to face the issue or face the issues. This is a picture of Generation Z. These are the markers that experts and researchers say are the markers of this generation. Who is Generation Z? If you have a child that is between the ages roughly of 6 years old to 26 years old, you are parenting, auntying, uncling, grandparenting a Gen Zer. And here's what the research and data tells us. They are the loneliest generation in the history of our country. They are, ladies and gentlemen, anxiety, depression, and suicide-ridden. 1 out of every 5 Gen Zers is self-harming, whether cutting or eating disorders. And that statistic, by the way, 10 years ago was 1 in 12. It's now 1 in 5. 1 in 6 are considering suicide, and that 1 in 6 data point increases 300% if it is an issue of sexual orientation. And I just need to say this very, very clearly. You don't fake anxiety, depression, and suicide. They fake being okay. They're that lonely. They live in a constant state of anxiety and comparison. And part of the reason why they live in a constant state of anxiety and comparison is because they are the most Wi-Fi enabled generation in the history of our country. They are the digital natives, adults. We are the digital immigrants. That's why, sir, ma'am, when something breaks with the internet, you go to them because they know. For those of you that care, it's estimated that about 91% of this generation goes to bed with their smartphone in their hand. And this is a crazy data point. 32% of them would rather not take a shower for a week than be without their cell phone for a week. So smell you later. Now you know what's going on. That being connected on the internet is that important to them. They are the most multiracial generation in the history of our country. For those of you that care, if you are Caucasian in the room, by the year 2045, you will be the minority in America. That number, we live just north of Atlanta, Georgia. Pray for us, Florida fans in Georgia. Obnoxious people those people are. But if I hear Herschel Walker one more time, but anyway. The data point is 2045 for our nation. The data point for the greater Atlanta area is 2030, and we've already bypassed it. And here's what the beautiful thing about your teenagers and children and college students, the beautiful thing about them is they see color and celebrate it. The issue with Generation Z as it relates to being multiracial is not Generation Z. It's their parents. It's their parents' parents. They're the most sexually fluid generation in the history of our country. If there are 20 Gen Zers in a room, there is a very high probability someone of non-traditional sexual orientation is in the room. And all of us in this room can have our own particular take, our view about sexual fluidity. But here's what I would present to you with all my heart and compassion. On the opposite side of your view, sir, ma'am, is a who. Is a person. They're the first post-Christian generation in the history of America. The best way that I can illustrate that, about 4% of Generation Z consider themselves to have some sort of biblical worldview. But the best way to think about post-Christian, I did not grow up in church, but I grew up in a home where if my dad said God said or the Bible said, I would say yes. This generation is growing up, and if you say God said or the Bible said, they say so, because that idea has lost authority in their life. I am of the opinion that post-Christian, for all of us as adults and leaders in this room, is the greatest gift the faith communities of our country could receive, because it allows us to begin to frame our faith around the very thing it was supposed to be framed around in the first place, and that is, everybody ready? The resurrection of Jesus from the dead, okay? The resurrection the resurrection of Jesus from the dead is the foundation of our faith. If you're not impressed that Jesus rose from the dead, try it. Die right now and try to come back to life. We'll wait. But this is what you know. You can't pull that off. And it's what allows us to help in this generation go, you know what? You can disagree with all of this periphery stuff, but what do you do with Jesus? What do you do with Jesus? They're the most self-directed generation in the history of our country. The reason why they're so self-directed, and I know I'm preaching to the choir this morning because most of you as parents, the fact that you're here means that you're not underprotective, but the vast majority of Generation Z generally are parented by underprotective parents. The reason why their parents are so underprotective is because their parents were parented by helicopter parents. And so their parents, Generation Z's parents, go to one of two extremes. They either become snowplow parents, where instead of preparing the child for the path, they prepare the path for the child, or the vast majority of them become Carrie Underwood parents, and Jesus take the wheel. You're just going to have to do your thing because I'm not going to be like my parents. The other thing that contributes to that is because, and we're parents of Generation Z, my generation, our generation of parents are the first generation of parents in the room that have not and are fighting everything we can. We do not look forward to getting old. My parents could not wait for their kids to get married, for them to have grandchildren, for them to sit in a rocking chair and die. It was like their goal. We parents are doing everything we can to not grow old. That's my haircut and this outfit, but that's a whole nother thing. Think about the number of parents that you see posting pictures and selfies with red Solo cups because we don't want to grow old. And this is so important. It doesn't mean that the next generation is maturing faster. It just means they're exposed to more sooner, which means their childhood has disappeared, which means they're having to grow older, younger. And then there's this last marker. For those of you that don't know, the average age Generation Z has been exposed to pornography in our culture, 11 years old. About 83% of Generation Z have reported that they have received some sexually explicit image or message via text or email. And for those of you that care, most of them developmentally are not prepared from just a developmental standpoint to translate that. So they become sexually saturated. And the byproduct of that is that young men objectify young women, and this is the part that breaks my heart most. Young women objectify themselves. These are the brutal facts. And we can duck our head and we can turn our head and we can say that this isn't for us. But this is what's happening with the next generation. And my question is, does it break your heart? Does it break your heart? I find it so challenging that a man who had never been to Jerusalem gets word that this is what's happening in your city, and he broke down and wept. But it's not the only thing that he did. The second thing he did is he became responsible to what is true. He became responsible to what is true. There's, again, you do this on your own time. But if you read the first chapter of Nehemiah, it's his memoir. He's literally telling this in his voice. But you get to the very last verse of chapter 11, and Nehemiah throws this little caveat in. And it just says, I was cupbearer to the king, which, and literally everything else doesn't make sense as to why he throws that in there. And the first time I read it, I literally thought, oh, he's trying to shirk responsibility. He's having, if I may, a Billy Joel moment. He's going, we didn't start the fire. I didn't do this. I wasn't even born in Babylon. I wasn't a part of that. And isn't that the temptation for all of us in this room? You could go, I'm not a parent, or my children are little. And by the way, for those of you that have toddler and elementary age, you're parenting teenagers now. You could go, this isn't for me because my kids are older. But here's what I started understanding about Nehemiah. When he says, I was cupbearer to the king, here's what he's in essence saying. He's going, because of my proximity to the king, I can leverage some things that other people can't. And if I may, there are some of us in this room, you have talents, you have skills, you have a position, you have a job, you have a home that the next generation desperately needs your heart to be broken for, and for you to leverage whatever position, talent, skill you have for the sake of the next generation. And I know you're sitting here and this is what you're thinking, but Stuart, I'm not a parent. You're not responsible only if you're a parent. And this is the curse of the American church, because what we do is we hire people to handle our issues. So you could go, well, you're only responsible if you're a pastor, only if you're a pastor. You're not responsible if you're a parent. You're not responsible only if you're a pastor. We are responsible because we're Jesus people. And Jesus people should look at what's happening in the next generation and go, for the sake of their future and their faith. How do I leverage whatever influence I have for the sake of the next generation? When Jesus' people ignore, this is so important. When Jesus' people ignore the issues in their community, they forfeit their right to have any influence in that community. And I wonder if some of us have turned our head because we don't want to face this. And this is a part of our tension as well, because we get caught in this crazy muddling of being right versus having influence. You're going to feel that a lot. And I just want to, hopefully this will help you. I don't have to be right to have influence, but I cannot have influence if I have to be right. Everybody okay? I don't have to be right to have influence, but I cannot have influence if I am so dogmatic about being right. And even if I am right, this is important for us to get to. How do I influence the next generation toward what is right if I don't have any influence? And that's where a ton of us are as it relates to the next generation. We want so much for them to know what's right, but if we don't have any influence, we can't lead them toward what's right. Here's the point. And this is what Nehemiah teaches us. You don't have influence because you're right. You have influence because you care. And here's where scores of us sitting and listening and watching this morning are. You're a parent and you know this is right. Because you understand the stakes. They're higher than we can even fathom. So the last thing, and we can learn this from Nehemiah, and the last thing for you and I, especially for those of us that are on the periphery and we don't think we have responsibility, is just go see for yourself. Just go see for yourself. If you keep reading the story in chapter 2, Nehemiah one day his job as a cupbearer, by the way, was a pretty minuscule job, but apparently Nehemiah was really good at it. Here's what a Hebrew cupbearer to the Persian king would basically do. He would taste the wine, and if the wine was poisoned, he would die. So it was a very you are dispensable, okay? But he was apparently really good at it because you had to have integrity and character to be good at it. One day he goes to serve Artaxerxes the wine, and Artaxerxes notices that he's kind of downtrodden. He's sad. And he's not usually like that. And he's like, dude, what's wrong? And he goes, well, if it pleases the king, my people are suffering back in Judah. And the king says, well, what can I do to help? And he says, well, if you give me the ability to go back and help them, that would be amazing. And not only does Artaxerxes sign into edict that, yes, you can go back, but he literally gives him a security detail and a ton of Home Depot gift cards so that he can buy all the lumber that he needs to rebuild the city walls. And what does Nehemiah do as soon as he gets that ability? He goes to Jerusalem, and this is interesting. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. And here's what Nehemiah would do. He would get on a donkey at night, and he would literally ride around the city and take notes. And he would go, that's got to be fixed, and we've got to repair that, and that's got to be taller, and that's got to be dug deeper. He went to see for himself. And that's the issue for a lot of us in this room. The reason why you don't care, and the reason why it's not emotional, and the reason why it doesn't connect is for a lot of us, we haven't gotten close enough to it. Because proximity, ladies and gentlemen, will change your perspective. You get close to it, and it will change you. And in fairness, part of the reason why I'm emotional about it is because we have 3 kids who are Gen Zers. We have a Gator among you who attends this church. It is close and personal to us. But it should be close and personal to all of us. And I understand. I'm talking about an Old Testament story, and it's the week before Thanksgiving, and you wanted something a whole lot more happy. And what is black olives is of the devil. I mean, all that stuff. And I should stop there. So I get that. But here's what I would love to do. Maybe I'm not as compelling, and you certainly can get much more incredible speakers. But maybe what I need to do is take it out of the spiritual and put it into another genre to help you understand how getting close and personal, going seeing for you. Let's just say that what I'm trying to compel you and inspire you to do is to become a passionate mountain climber. Okay? Because there are so many mountains in Gainesville. So this is what I decided to do. I'm going to try to inspire you to become a passionate mountain climber. And this is what I decided to do. You know what? I'm going to show you some movies about mountain climbing. So I show you the movie Cliffhanger, where apparently Sylvester Stallone thought it was a smart idea to wear CPS shorts in sub-zero temperatures. That's a whole nother thing. And I show you the movie Vertical Limit, and it's so bad that you're like, could you show me another movie? And then I go, you know what? Not a movie. Let's go documentary. And so I show you the documentary Free Solo, which will scare you. 5 minutes in, my palms were sweaty because this fool climbed El Capitan without a rope, okay? He is bona fide crazy, okay? Or maybe you've seen this movie, Everest. You saw the movie Everest, and you're like, that was a pretty good movie, but some of you saw the movie Everest, but you also know that the movie Everest is based on a book by John Krakauer called Into Thin Air, and you read the book and you saw the movie. Y'all know people like this. They read the book and they see the movie, and then they say to you, I read the book, I saw the movie, but the book was so much better. Y'all know people like that? The movie was good, but the book was so much better. I think they call those people annoying. I don't know if you know those people, but you read the book, and then you guys have an REI in Gainesville. You can go to REI and get a checklist of all the things that you need to become a passionate mountain climber. Now watch. You watch a ton of movies about mountain climbing. You watch a documentary about mountain climbing. You read a book about mountain climbing. You even get a checklist about mountain climbing. Does that make you a passionate mountain climber? No. Can I tell you why I have friends who are passionate about mountain climbing? Psst, they climbed a mountain. And maybe the reason why moms and dads in this room are near tears, and some of us who aren't close to Generation Z are going, huh? Is because you haven't gone to see for yourself. Because once you go and see for yourself, it changes. But Stuart, why does the next generation desperately need me? Because everybody needs somebody who sees them the way that Jesus does. Everyone needs someone who will love them the way that Jesus does. And it's our responsibility. Can I tell you where I learned that the most? I owe some of you in this room a huge thank you, because what you may not know is March and April 2020, I spent in a medically induced coma. I contracted COVID-19 and fought for my life all of April 2020. Gator Soccer and this athletic department did all kinds of stories about it. But some of you in this room, you prayed. You're the reason why I'm alive. What most people don't know, that was in March and April of 2020. This is a picture of my dad, Jimmy O'Neill Hall, decorated Vietnam War veteran, as crusty as they come. Some of you have a father like this, dogmatic, set in his ways, completely convinced he was right. He would give you his opinion and expect you to change yours. That was my father. My father passed away in January of 2020 before I got sick. In many ways, I'm grateful that he passed away before I got sick. Men, if you're in this room, my dad, if there's a way to die as a man, my dad did it. EMT found my father in his home, sitting in his recliner, with his legs crossed, his crossword puzzle on his lap, his pen still in his hand, cup of coffee beside him, half-eaten biscuit beside him, watching the 52-inch television that he told me to buy him for Christmas, and it's on Sports Center. That's the way to die right there. That's how they found my father. My dad has my mom and dad had 10 grandchildren, 5 of them college athletes. My dad was an unbelievable athlete. I brought a picture of him playing basketball in high school. For those of you that don't know anything about basketball, that's my dad on top, and you're not supposed to do that. I'm the oldest of 3 sons. And as the oldest of 3 sons, I'm the executor of his will. And as I mentioned, my dad was incredibly opinionated. He believed he was right on almost everything. And of his 10 grandchildren, And every family has that one family member who's a bit eccentric and out there, a bit different. You guys know who they are. You're thinking about them right now. And if nobody comes to your mind, it's probably because you're that person in your family. We had that grandchild in our family. And as the executor of my dad's will, I discovered after my dad passed away that he willed his prized possession, his pickup truck, to his grandchild, who used to be my niece, but now she's my nephew. It was his way of saying, on the other side of my view is you. I care about you. It's the greatest lesson I've ever learned about going and seeing for yourself. And maybe that's what John was chipping away at when he wrote in 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. Those of us who say we live in God should live our lives as Jesus did. And it's why I say to those of us in this room as parents who are fighting for the heart and the soul and the mind of your child, and you are tempted to get out of the messy middle, don't you dare. And for those of us who stand on the periphery, the next generation desperately needs you. After the first service, I had a high school teacher and a psychologist walk up to me, and they both said, please keep pressing the gas because you have no idea how right this is. So what is it that you need to do to lend your heart, your hands, your mind, your heart to the next generation? And this is a heads up for all of us. They are not problems to be fixed. They are people to be loved. They're not problems to be fixed. They're people to be loved. And if you're wondering, how does this relate to Nehemiah? If I may, can I present to you your Jerusalem? Where 52,000 plus Gen Zers live, play, study. Go see for yourself. Be responsible to what is true. But you have to face the brutal facts. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, thank you for the moms and dads, the small group leaders, the children's directors, the elementary age school teachers, middle school and high school teachers, college students, professors, administrators in this room, especially the moms and dads and grandparents, aunties and uncles, cousins, neighbors. We do life in such close proximity with the next generation. Would you, like Nehemiah, would you break our heart? Would you move us? Would you help us to become responsible with the little bit or the a lot of bit that we have, to leverage it for the sake of the next generation, because the faith of the next generation is worth everything. Would you give us the courage, the heart, to stay in the messy middle, because they are people to be loved, not problems to be solved. And would you teach us a lesson from a deceased, crusty Vietnam veteran? May we not wait to death to extend our love in life. And we pray this in the only name that matters, the name of Jesus, and who we want the next generation to know. Amen.